Bonjour à tous, je me présente, Marie-André Lamontagne, directrice générale, programmation et communication du Festival littéraire international Metropolis Bleu. First of all, I want to thank you for being here today as we are going to award the Prix de la diversité Metropolis Bleu, Conseil des arts de Montréal. The Conseil des arts de Montréal is the main sponsor of the Prix de la diversité, to which the Cole Foundation and McGill University are also associated. La situation sanitaire présente nous oblige à procéder différemment cette année, vous l'aurez compris, pour ce qui est de la remise de ce prix. Voilà pourquoi elle a lieu dans les bureaux de Métropolis Bleu, en présence d'un nombre restreint de personnes, heureusement compensé par la diffusion en ligne, qui est devenue la règle dans le monde de la culture et dans d'autres mondes également. Before going ahead with the announcement of the 2020 winner, I want to briefly remind you the former winners of the Prix de la diversité Metropolis Bleu, Conseil des arts de Montréal. In 2016, Gayas Hakem. In 2017, Shui Yiwei. In 2018, Alina Dumitrescu. In 2019, Yara El-Ghadban. All Montrealers, all with an immigrant background, all emerging writers and good writers, of course, which is precisely what the award is looking for. 5 années d'existence, donc, pour un prix qui s'impose de plus en plus comme un jalon significatif dans le paysage littéraire montréalais. Les membres du jury 2020, on va le préciser, étaient Gayas Hakem, Oana Avasili-Chozai, Katia Gubricic et moi-même, Marie-André Lamontagne. I want to thank them and to thank also the publishing houses in French and English for their responses to our call for submission. And I want to thank our partners, among them specifically le Conseil des arts de Montréal, dont on entendra bientôt la directrice générale, Madame Nathalie Maillet. Mais d'abord, let's have a look at the short list, which is per se very strong and interesting. Deuxième position, Myrna Charine pour son récit d'une émigration intitulé « La jeune fille qui venait d'ailleurs » et c'est paru chez Québec Amérique. Third position, Bindu Suresh for a novel 26 Knots, Invisible Publishing. Congratulations to both of you. And then the 2020 winner is William Ging Wee Dere for his book, part essay, part memoir, Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress and Belonging, Douglas and McIntyre being the publishing house. William Ging Wee Dere, please join me. I mean, respecting, of course, the social distancing. Please accept that trophy, which is the incarnation of the prize, and the 5,000 purse that comes with the prize.
Thank you very much, Marie-André. Merci beaucoup.
J'invite maintenant Mme Nathalie Maillet, directrice générale du Conseil des arts de Montréal, à prendre la parole. Madame Maillet.
Merci, Madame Lamontagne. Alors, je suis ravie d'être avec vous pour la remise du prix de la diversité Métropolis Bleu, Conseil des arts de Montréal. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Bravo pour l'organisation de cet événement dans un contexte si particulier. Nous sommes ici très peu nombreux, comme l'a mentionné Madame Lamontagne. C'est vraiment un plaisir de se retrouver entre nous. C'est une fierté de nous associer à cette 5e édition du Festival MB pour la remise du prix de la diversité littérature. Ce prix est hautement symbolique au Conseil des arts de Montréal. Il récompense la publication d'un écrivain au Québec issu de l'immigration et qui représente très bien la diversité culturelle montréalaise. Il favorise la reconnaissance et l'inclusion d'auteurs qui reflètent la diversité des voix. Et il faut savoir que pour le Conseil des arts de Montréal, l'inclusion et la diversité sont 2 grandes priorités. De nombreuses initiatives ont été mises en place ces 15 dernières années, qu'on pense aux stages, aux résidences, aux prix, comme c'est le cas aujourd'hui, et les nombreuses subventions qui sont octroyées à chaque année. L'objectif pour nous est d'offrir un accès égal à tous, et donc dans un processus d'équité, de nous assurer de la reconnaissance des communautés qui sont le terreau de la vie culturelle montréalaise. En allouant une bourse de 5 000 $ aux lauréats du prix de la diversité MB, le Conseil honore un écrivain et félicite pour la réussite de son œuvre, l'invite évidemment à poursuivre ses projets d'écriture et reconnaît les auteurs issus de la diversité culturelle montréalaise. Alors, je salue les finalistes et particulièrement le lauréat William Ging Wee Dere, le lauréat du Prix de la diversité Metropolis Bleu 2020. La diversité de vos voix est essentielle à la vitalité artistique de notre ville et nous allons évidemment vous suivre et bien sûr vous lire, continuer d'écrire. Je terminerai en remerciant Mme Marie-André Lamontagne qui chapeaute le festival, sans oublier toute l'équipe qu'on ne voit pas, mais qui travaille ardemment pour la réussite de ce festival. Vous nous faites découvrir d'autres regards et des auteurs toujours plus prometteurs. Vous nous donnez le goût de lire et vous savez nous réunir. C'est un beau partage. Merci à vous toutes et à vous tous. Merci.
Now, William Ging Wee Dere, we want to hear you as the winner. Please join me.
Thank you, Madame Lamontagne, Madame Maillet, merci beaucoup. As an immigrant settler, I acknowledge that we are on unceded indigenous lands of the traditional territory of both the Kanaka and the Anishinaabe peoples. I am honored to receive the 2020 Blue Metropolis Conseil des Arts de Montréal Diversity Prize. I wish to thank Blue Metropolis and the Conseil des Arts, as well as the judges, for selecting my book, Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging, for this award. This recognition is not only for myself, but it's also a recognition of the contributions of the Chinese community in Montreal over the past 150 years. In 2005, my late mother, Ye Dong-sing, was presented with a certificate of commemoration by the mayor, Gérard Tremblay, for her, and I quote, sacrifices and contributions that shaped the social, economic, and cultural development of Montreal. In the public discourse today, we are striving for diversity. Diversity means living with people who are different from us, to respect and to try to understand our neighbors. It means to recognize diverse people, other than the dominant culture, as an integral and equal part of society. It means inclusion into the power structures and the decision-making processes. It means a true recognition of the realities of Quebec and Canada. However, diversity is only the first step in the fight against racism. Indigenous people have been resisting racism and genocide since the first days of colonial settlement in Canada and Quebec. Black people have been resisting racism and enslavement for 400 years since they were torn from the African continent. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities are claiming their identity and place of belonging in Canada and Quebec. More and more literature and art are coming out of these communities. This literature is part of the Canadian and Quebec fabric that can no longer be excluded from the mainstream. The Blue Met and Conseil des Arts are doing their share to promote diversity. Blue Met has featured literature and discussions important to BIPOC communities in the last few years. I urge you to do more to promote the fight against racism with the recognition that systemic racism does exist in Quebec, and to impress upon the provincial leaders that acknowledgement of the problem of systemic racism is the first step for tackling racial discrimination here. Thank you.
Place maintenant à l'entretien. William Ging Wee Dere répondra aux questions de Janet Lum, que je vous présente brièvement. Janet Lum is an artist, a third-generation Chinese-Canadian. She is, as she said, a social activist in her heart, mind, and spirit, inspired by people, arts, culture, education, and ecology. Janet, William, we are listening to you.
Wow! Incroyable. Je suis très, très, très touchée par le fait qu'on fait une célébration avec grâce à le Métropolis Bleu. Et c'était vraiment touchante. I'm so thrilled to be part of this event of acknowledging your contribution in this book. It's a thrill to, number one, be the person who is honored, to honor you. And it's a treat, having been here for so long, to really see acknowledgement of diversity, cultural diversity being highlighted more and more, as we both know how that works. C'était vraiment, je suis vraiment touchée. I'm really super touched. I want to just also thank, if I haven't already thanked everybody, the Metropolis Bleu, le Conseil des Arts de Montréal, all the people who are here that you don't see because they're all behind the scenes, but that's how it works, is there's a whole bunch of people back here working really hard to make this happen, even though it just looks like just me and William here. So I want you to understand that. This is part of learning about how television and film and video works. Do you want to give a little summary?
Merci beaucoup, Janet. It's been about a year since I last saw you. With the pandemic and everything else, it's been difficult to get together. I know you're an old friend and comrade from way back. So in terms of how and why I wrote this book, when I retired, in fact, I retired with the aim of writing this book. I retired about 6 years ago in 2014 because I wanted the time to write this book. And the reason why I wanted to write this book is because I wanted to tell my story of what it means to be a Chinese Canadian, what it means to be Chinese here in Quebec. And associated with that, I was engaged in the head tax redress movement for about 20 odd years, 2 decades. And that was a period in Canadian history that's very little known by the larger society. In fact, it wasn't that well known by the Chinese Canadian community either, except for the Lowakil, the old overseas Chinese who lived through that period of head tax and Chinese Exclusion Act. And so that included my father and my grandfather, who had to pay the $500 head tax each. And that included my mother, who was separated from my father for about 30 years because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that included my whole family who were affected by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I had to tell that story, and I had to tell the story in such a way, it had to be a story of redemption. A redemption for my family, and also redemption for the Canadian society for inflicting 62 years of state-sanctioned racism against a whole community here in Canada. And so based on that, I sat down to write the book. I had a lot of material because I was involved. I was one of the leaders, I guess you can call that, of the redress movement, the Pan-Canadian redress movement that we went through with the Chinese Canadian National Council and the Chinese Canadian Redress Alliance. And so I had a lot of documentation, I had a lot of interviews, and in fact, the interviews that I did while we were making Moving the Mountain, the documentary on the head tax struggle, and where we first met about 30 years ago, because you were the musical director of that film. And so there was a lot of material. And I wanted to put it together and to present that to people who may or may not be interested, but it had to be presented so that the record is there for all to see of what the Chinese Canadian community went through over the last 150 years. So that's why I wrote this book. It took me 2 years. It took me 2 years every day. I had to be disciplined. I had to sit down in front of the word processor for at least 4 hours a day, and sometimes it's a lot longer than that. But I made a rule that after 8 p.m. I had to turn it off. And so I went back at it the next day. So almost every day for 2 years, I worked on this book. It paid off. I thought it was a good story. It was a story of my family. It was a story of our community. It was a story of the laureates who never got to see their families. So I have to lend voice to that, to all of these people. So I guess that's how this book came about. In fact, it was accepted for publication by three, I think it was 3 publishers. But I chose the one that I went with because of their past history of publishing Chinese Canadian literature. And you know Jim Wong Chu. Jim Wong Chu used to work for them, and other people like that were associated with Douglas and McIntyre. And so that's why I went with them.
One of the things that you were talking about was that rose some other questions. My grandfather worked on the railroad back in 1898. So this is really, and as a third generation Chinese Canadian, this is something that is so important to have out and for other people to know about. And only if we are the community ourselves, but the next generation Chinese Canadians don't know, and the new generations of non-Chinese and everyone else knows, as you said, knows zero about the building blocks and the railroad and who did all of that work to create this incredible country that we live in. And yes, there's problems, and yes, I just finished talking about how, you know, we're living in these crazy, crazy, crazy times. But I am so lucky and feel so grateful for being here in Canada because of what's going on everywhere. So the fact that my grandfather helped to build the railroad, and now this book is being awarded for the Diversity Prize. It's like hundreds of years of acknowledgement that has come to this moment right now, and it's a real joy, thrill, and je suis tellement touchée par ça. I wanted to ask you the title, Being Chinese in Canada. Do you want to talk about that? Like, it's not Chinese Canadian, it's like being Chinese in Canada. Can you talk about that, please?
There's not much to say about that because it wasn't my original title.
It wasn't?
No. My original title was Red China Man. But the publisher thought it was a bit, I don't know, maybe he thought it was a bit dated because Red China was something you called China back in those days. The reason why I went with that as a working title is because of my communist organizing days here in Quebec, here in Montreal. In fact, when I was doing that here in Montreal, that was the most integrated I was with the Quebecois community. It was the best French I ever spoke was during those years. But after that was over, I lost my French and I lost.
During the communist kind of like during which part of like the movement of the
Maoist movement.
The Maoist movement.
Les Marxists, Leninists, les Maoists. So I have a whole section on that life in the party, life after the party. Because when I threw out the idea of writing a book on the redress movement, I spoke to my daughter, and my daughter said, "Why don't you write about the party days? Because I love it when you and Mommy tell me stories about what you did during the party." And
can you explain what you mean by party, please? We don't.
It's not like partying all the time. It's party means the Workers' Communist Party, the Parti Communiste Ouvrier that we had here, or the League Communist, Marxist-Leninists, which was the predecessor of the WCP.
The WCB?
WCP, Workers' Communist Party in English. That's where, you know, the French and English were always interchangeable in my mind, you know, during that period of time. And so that was the original title because of that. And because of my organizing here in Montreal, I learned the skills to organize around the redress for the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so I had to thank those years for giving me those skills and letting me push myself to achieve at least a partial redress. Because in 20 years, you know, a lot of people drop out, a lot of people burn out, and a lot of people give up. But because I had that vision of struggle that I learned in my youth, that I kept going. And finally, in 2006, the Canadian government was forced to give an apology, and they redressed the survivors, the head tax survivors and the widows of head taxpayers who had passed away. But nevertheless, you know, 99% of Chinese Canadian families were never redressed because they did not live long enough to see Stephen Harper assume powers as Prime Minister. But getting back to this title, Being Chinese in Canada, I have a chapter in the book called Being Chinese in Canada, because I was also associated with a film called...
You were also what?
Associated.
Oh, associated, okay.
With a film called Être chinois au Québec, Being Chinese in Quebec. So I thought, well, let's have a series of being Chinese or being Spanish or being Filipino in Canada, you know, and this is part of the drive for diversity. Because if you're one of these people in Canada, of course, you're being that person here in Canada. So, and you have a story to tell. And so I thought that title was also suitable. Some people might say, yeah, it's very academic, you know. But nevertheless, being Chinese in Quebec, in Canada, it's what I am.
Yeah, you brought something up again. When I was 13 years old, I came home with a book on Mao. And maybe 14, just entering into high school. And I came home with the book, and I was really proud of the book, because for me that was like part of, you know, what I thought was like the Chinese, my background with my parents and everything like that. And so I came home with the book, and my father saw me with the book, and he slapped me in the face, took the book and threw it out the window because, and I didn't realize until later, it was because my grandmother, or my father's mother, was whipped 100 times before she just died from being part of sort of, I guess, capitalism and being, you know, rich in China or whatever, even though my father came here not rich. So this book is really sort of bringing a lot of unconscious root things for me that I didn't recall until this book, you know. And I know, yes, you did write a whole chapter on being Chinese in Quebec, but I just in Canada, but in Quebec, that's another book.
No, but that chapter is called Être chinois au Québec. Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, and many people from my father and my grandfather's generation. My grandfather came to Canada in 1909, and he brought my father here in 1921. And they ended up working in a hand laundry in Verdun, as well as on the east end of Montreal on Route Patenay, you know, for 30 years. And they came from the tradition of the Guomindang, Sun Yat-sen. But Sun Yat-sen was...
Can you explain what Guomindang?
Okay, Guomindang was the nationalist party in China. At the beginning, it was a very progressive pro-people party under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, who fought for the overthrow of the emperor, I guess, the Chinese feudal system. And in 1912, the Republic of China was founded by the Kuomintang, by Sun Yat-sen. And so my father and my grandfather came from that tradition. And their whole life, they supported the Kuomintang. And they did not support the Communist Party, even though the Communist Party defeated the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party led the resistance against the Japanese. But they were anti-communist as well. And
they were what?
Anti-communist.
Who's they again?
And my father and grandfather.
Okay, your parents were. Okay.
Yeah, whereas my mother, who actually lived through the Communist Revolution, in the Communist Party, or the communists in her village, collectivized the land. She lived through that whole period. She was not anti-communist. So, you know, these kinds of things, you know, it happens in the family. Whereas I grew up with this whole anti-communist sentiment, and yet I became a communist. I mean, go figure.
Go figure. Well, we're all strange creatures. We live in a strange world.
The book explains why I became a communist.
Okay. Well, this is really hoping to grab people's ears in terms of wanting to know these type of questions.
Yeah.
Knowing what you do know about the history of the Chinese in Canada, and your family history and your own personal struggles, what kind of advice would you give to young people who are questioning their identity?
You mentioned earlier that the Chinese community is constantly changing, constantly in transition. So the legacy of the head tax movement, and it's only been about 15 years since we won the apology. And so the young people who are coming up today, they probably have no consciousness of that whole struggle.
Can you give a summary of what this head tax is for people who may not know about the head tax and haven't read the book yet?
Okay, well, the head tax started in 1885 when after the Canadian Pacific Railway was finished. People like your grandfather or great-grandfather.
My grandfather.
Your grandfather helped build the CPR out in Western Canada. And so after the CPR was completed, there was no more need for Chinese laborers. And so they made it as uncomfortable as possible for the Chinese to stay here in Canada. But Chinese still came because China was a very poor country. It was dominated by Western powers, like the British, who waged 2 opium wars against China, and the unequal treaties that they imposed on China. So China was impoverished, and so many Chinese from the villages came to North America that they call Gold Mountain, because of the gold rush that was going on at that time.
Out in where's the Gold Mountain again for people?
Well, the gold rush started in about 1850 in California, and then moved up to the Fraser Valley in Canada. And so people thought that you can come to Canada and pick gold off the streets or off the ground, and so that's why they call it Gold Mountain, which is pretty much North America, and that name has stuck. And so they came. They came to Canada, but the government, and there was a royal commission. Imagine that, a royal commission on Chinese immigration back in the late 1800s. And through that royal commission, they tried to exclude Chinese people from immigrating to Canada. And so first it was a $50 head tax that they imposed. Every person who was admitted into Canada had to pay $50. Then it was raised to $100. in the early 1900s. And then in 1903, it was raised finally to $500.
And this was only for the Chinese?
Only for Chinese immigrants. And $500 in those days could buy you 2 houses or 200 acres of prime land. And so you can imagine how much money the Chinese had to raise. And they did it. They borrowed money from overseas compatriots or borrowed money from their fellow villagers to come over to Canada and then they had to repay. So there was a great deal of debt in the Chinese Canadian community because of that. So up until 1923, the Chinese were still coming because the Chinese were very industrious and they wanted to go where they can earn a living and to support themselves and their families. So in 1923, the Canadian government thought, there's still too many Chinese coming, and they're still coming. And so we'll pass another law. And this was when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And no Chinese, not even those who were trying to bring their families to join them, were allowed to bring them into Canada. So my father and my grandfather were stuck here without their families. And my father went back to China every 5 or 10 years or so, and that's when his children were born. And so that's how the Chinese Canadian community grew in Canada. They didn't. In fact, the community stagnated because it was 62 years. Imagine that, 62 years of legislation aimed at a particular community here in Canada. And that's why, we are opposed to Bill 21, because when a government passes legislation aimed at a particular community in Canada or in Quebec, then it sets up the atmosphere in society to be less welcoming and less accepting of these peoples. And that's exactly what happens when the government passes legislation against a certain community.
I have a question for you, which is, knowing with all what you've gone through, what advice do you give to young people who are questioning their identity?
A very good question, and I think that's the question that very few of us ask. But I think it's going to be important to a lot of people, especially the young people, because we're constantly fighting against the forces of assimilation. And it's always very easy to fold into the mainstream. And the fact that the Chinese community is in a constant state of flux, transition, with new immigrants coming in. And so our history is not that well known within our community. No, first it was the Toisanese of my grandfather's generation.
Can you explain what Toisanese is?
Well, Toisan is the area, the county that most of the early Chinese immigrants came from. And so even when I came here as a kid, you hear Toisanese being spoken as the main dialect in Chinatown. And then it was replaced by the Hong Kong people. And so it was Cantonese. And now it's Mandarin. And so you have a lot of young people who speak Mandarin now, and a lot of young people who go to French schools because of Bill 101, and they come up perfectly trilingual. They speak Mandarin, French, and English. And so it's very easy to fall into the process of assimilation if you don't know yourself, if you don't know your culture, you don't know your history. And so the advice I would give to young people is that get to know yourself apart from what you learn in school. Because you don't learn about yourself in school. No, you might learn how to feel what you are in school, but you never really learn about your community in school. So learn about yourself in school. not in school, but learn about yourself by reading books, by finding out, by organizing, by socializing with people who are like you. In the face of racism, you need to be with your own people in order to fight against racism. But if you feel that you've never been affected by racism, and in fact you blend in like anybody else, that's okay too. That's where you are at. And so what I say to young people is know yourself, know your culture, and know your history, and then only by doing so, you'll feel more confident in your identity. And once you feel more confident in your identity, then you take pride in your identity. And once you do that, then you can stand up for yourself and stand up for your community.
Okay, just to give people a sense of the language, Chinese language, but you mentioned Toisan, Hong Kong, Chinese, Cantonese, and then Mandarin. Do you want to just pick one simple phrase and just say them in Toisan, and then in Guangdonghua, in Cantonese, and then in Putonghua in Mandarin, just so people have a sense of, even though it's the Chinese language, how vast the different dialects are. Would you be able to?
You're really putting me on the spot here. If you ask my wife, she would do it because she speaks Toisanese, Cantonese, and Mandarin. Whereas I speak none of these languages, none of these dialects. I don't even speak English or French properly. So you can imagine how I can't.
Well, simple words like hek, siktan, hektan, cherfan, okay? For example.
Hey, that's very good. Okay, in Toisanese, it's hekfan. In Cantonese, it's seitfan. And in Mandarin, it's cherfan. How's that?
Okay, perfect. That's great. I think it's good for people to know how, with such an old, ancient, ancestral history of language and how it's, how different it is, like a simple phrase like eating, and how varied it is in such a big country like. So I was just curious about.
Well, even just saying hello. In Toisanese, you would just say "homa."
Homa, which means.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
In Cantonese, is "ni homa."
Ni homa.
No, they don't say "ni" because they don't say there's no N sound in Cantonese, so they say "le homa."
Le homa. And
then in Mandarin, it's "ni homa."
Ni homa. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's great. Again, I'm going to ask about how would you imagine or see greater equity, justice between peoples and communities politically, in Canada, systematically in Canada? Like, how would you imagine? What would you see if we had more justice and equity, and what would create a little scenario? It does. I know it's a whole other book, maybe a whole other dissertation on something, but just like an image of what that would look like for you.
Well, that's why my book is. Do you call it subtitle? Anyway, the second part of the title, "The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging," I think it's fairly important. Those three words. Identity, redress, and belonging. So what is important is to be able to find your identity. Okay, what is your identity? So and you get together with like-minded people, and you enjoy yourselves with like-minded people, and so. When I was younger, I would be involved with a sort of a social club of Chinese Canadians, singles in those days. Very few of us were married, and so we which is very similar to the progressive Chinese of Quebec that we started off with.
Maybe you should talk a little bit so people know what that is, since you've mentioned it, because it's hard to give a name of a group but then not really explain what it is.
Okay, the Progressive Chinese of Quebec was started off as a social club of young people who get together to talk about the current events, talk about the issues here in Quebec. And we went through the Charter of Values, you know, taking positions on that and what that means for the Chinese community. We went through the aborted, I guess I can say the word aborted, Commission on Systemic Racism that the Liberal government passed, but then they withdrew. So we came together as more as an organization to put together a brief to that commission, but then the government canceled the commission. And now we're involved with the fight against Bill 21, which is where people of religious minorities cannot openly express or visually express their faith if you work for a government or if you're a teacher or anything associated with authority like the police, which means that the Minister of Defense of Canada cannot get a job here in Quebec because he wears a turban. Okay, so that's
yeah. So back to the question: how would you imagine equity, justice between peoples in a city in Montreal?
So you take part in various movements, take part in various struggles, but you have to know these struggles. And that's the first thing that you have to do, is to do your research. You know, it's very easy to be part of the crowd when the Black Lives Matter demonstrations were going on. You know, it's very easy to fall in line and march with your friends, but you have to understand the struggle. In order to make a long-term commitment, you have to know the struggle. You got to research the struggle. And that is the only way that you can work with others, in solidarity with others. And so I'm a firm believer of solidarity with other communities because the Chinese community here in Quebec is very small. 90,000 here in Montreal, 100,000 throughout the whole province of Quebec. And so we need to lend our support, and we need to call for the support of other communities to join us, to help us in our fight for equality, equity. And the numbers are there in terms of how many visible minorities are in the civil service. Very few. In fact, in Hydro-Quebec, I think there's about 400 people of visible minority people out of a workforce of 20,000, along those numbers. Anyways, it's in my book. I have to consult my book to get those numbers out. Projet Montréal administration, no one from the visible minorities were elected as councillors of Montreal. And I think 30% of the population of Montreal come from minorities, or maybe even 40%. Same thing goes with other places of authority like the police force and the fire department and so on. And so we have to fight for representation. We have to fight for equity in employment. And we have to fight for diversity in all of these institutions. And that is why I'm so thankful to the Blue Met and the Conseil des Arts de Montréal for coming up with this diversity prize to recognize the diversity of the people here in Montreal.
Yeah, I feel like my grandparents are here and so proud of seeing this book being acknowledged, not even written, acknowledged. And it is, it's an emotional thing because we've been here for so long and stomped on. And so this is, to sort of highlight it and to bring the history and the contributions and the suffering, but all of the gifts and that we've brought, our communities brought. My grandfather, your grandfather, my grandfather who worked on the railroad, and my mom, who's an incredible, she talks to, I still hear her, with this Jean Lum Foundation. My mom in Toronto, where she's encouraging young Chinese kids, and their money goes to them and from high school for getting good marks and giving them some money to go on to university. The contributions of cultural diversity, but like the Chinese in Canada is, I really do feel like my grandfather is like nodding and, with, just nodding with a pride of seeing this book being highlighted and being acknowledged. So I really am thankful.
Well, I think that's a very good word, is pride. We have to stop thinking, or we have to be careful that we don't think that we're victims. We cannot victimize ourselves. We have to take pride of what we do, and by taking pride, we can stand up and voice our positions here in Canada and Quebec. And so pride of your identity, I think, is very important, because we are not victims. I mean, the government might legislate against us to victimize our community, but we fight back. We take pride in what we do, and we will become an equitable and equal part of Canadian society. And this is where pride takes you, to become more equal, to stand side by side with the dominant communities.
Yeah. You did speak, oh yeah, and you don't have, maybe just mention, if you can, sort of what chapter with regards to the Quebec Stats and the numbers of the...
That's this book.
That's
the problem. No, I have my own book here, which I forgot.
Okay, just because I think it is something
it's a chapter called Being Chinese in Quebec, of all things.
Because it's not just in Quebec, it's across Canada. It's a phenomena that happens across Canada. It's varying different years according to certain areas, like in Toronto and in Vancouver, but still in the major, in Canada in general, we're still a very, invisible kind of contribution. And there's more and more acknowledgement of cultural diversity and people of color and and all of that diversity that makes up, and to the First Nations for sure. That's the biggest thing that I feel like the new generation is waking up to. And I do feel like being in Canada, we can be a little bit different from our neighbors below and have communities more who are culturally diverse to be recognized and acknowledged and highlighted, which I feel distinct here. Yeah.
Chapter 17, Being Chinese in Quebec. And that is very specific too. I mean, Quebec is a very specific part of Canada. And that's what sets it apart, because the situation here in Quebec is so vibrant. There's so many forces going on at the same time, competing with each other. And so it takes something for minorities to find their own space. And again, I have to give kudos to people like the Conseil des Arts de Montréal, Blue Met, for recognizing this diversity. And so it's through these efforts that we get to voice ourselves in the larger Quebec society, because we're inundated with everything else that's going on here in Quebec.
Well, I have read the book and we've worked together for a long time, but for me to have this book again, presented, and not just having the award, but really in every single way. It's, I'm truly touched, and I know my mom and my grandfather are here and being very, very proud of to the Blue Metropolis and to Conseil des Arts du Québec, Montreal, of having this book being gratefully submitted as the Diversity Prize. So I thank so much all of the people that you don't see behind these lights that are here. And it is very, very special. So I thank you also for watching this.
Voilà, c'est terminé. Je remercie William Ging Wee Dere et Janet Lum. Je remercie Madame Nathalie Maillet, directrice générale du Conseil des arts de Montréal. Je remercie notre équipe technique et logistique, Michael Abril, Jérôme Lafont, Céline Fernandez. Et je vous invite chaleureusement et fortement à lire, si ce n'est déjà fait, les ouvrages dont il a été question aujourd'hui, et en particulier celui du lauréat. Tous ces titres apparaissent sur le site de Métropolis Bleu. Je vous invite aussi à suivre le programme des journées Mémoire pour l'espoir, préparé par le Festival Métropolis Bleu et présenté dans le cadre du Salon du Livre de Montréal pour une bonne part. 12 activités donc entre le 12 et le 17 novembre 2020, incluant l'événement de clôture. I stop here since all the details are on our website, bluemetropolis.com/hope. Remembering to hope, that means hope, and metropolisbleu.com/mémoire. Au revoir, longue vie à la littérature.